It's a delight to be able to introduce the next speaker. As Hunter said, my name is Tim LaSalle, and I have a long history with Cal Poly, actually a lifetime history. But more recently, I've been engaged with the Rodale Institute on the East Coast, a research organic center, and then moved off to Africa for 4 years with the Howard Buffett Foundation and Howard's focus on hunger. What I think is powerful is this conference and our speakers here today are addressing all of these issues. And what became critically crucial to me in my own focus was climate, hunger, and water. And when you take those three components, a common denominator towards any sense of cure, any sense of fixability, is soil. So here we are talking about these matters today, and our next speaker that I've been privileged to know for a number of years now is one of the brightest people I know. She received her undergraduate degree at Stanford and went off to Essex, England, to get her PhD. She is true definition of a sustainability expert. Unfortunately, that word has been so co-opted today. But Ann Thrupp understands this from the sociological, the biological, the soil, the whole ecosystem understanding. And she has had, well, I guess I heard the term pioneer used before, and I know that Ann, even though she's much younger than I am, is one of the clear pioneers in the world of agricultural sustainability. She did work in Central America and Africa, and she worked with women, which I think is one of the sociological realms that often isn't visited about. One of her papers that came out was on women, work, and wood, because firewood, as we know in the developing world, is such a challenge. When she returned to California after her time and stint with the World Resource Institute, again working with similar issues, she worked with the EPA on an agricultural initiative, and then she moved to Fetzer. Well, part of the sustainability she worked was to pull together a manual on viticulture sustainability, and it's part of what Secretary Ross was talking about, and Ann's leadership in that. In our viticulture industry, a lot of its real grounding comes from Ann Thrupp's baseline work for the state of California and for that industry specifically. I want to mention now where she is now and perhaps why she's invited. She is now heading up the Berkeley Food Institute. And this I'm going to let Ann describe for you more thoroughly. But when we talk about thought shaping for the state and agriculture and food, the Berkeley Institute is a sort of an organization on the Berkeley campus that has brought together a lot of luminaries, the Michael Pollins and the Bittmans of the world. And Ann gets to, or has to, or somehow must, work with 105 faculty of world renown on that campus and students that are dramatically and significantly inspired by the question of food, food systems, and sustainability. And so I think we're deeply honored and greatly privileged to have Dr. Ann Thrupp to present to us today. Ann?
Well, thank you very much, Tim. That was a very nice introduction. And I'm really pleased to be here, and thank you all for staying on. I think following Karen Ross, Secretary Ross, is a difficult thing, but at the same time, I'm delighted to follow her footsteps. And I've had the fortune of working with Karen for a number of years while I was in the wine industry. We worked very closely together. She's always a great inspiration and a wonderful friend and wonderful supporter of many of the things that we're doing here. So I also hope that my comments will keep you awake. I know this is sometimes a tired time of the day, but I'm actually going to be changing the subtitle. I got permission of Hunter to really focus on the human dimensions. So the subtitle of my talk I'm calling People, Policy, Power, and Partnerships. So hopefully this will be a bit provocative for a fifth P to carry on this dialogue, and I really am honored to be here today. These are the main points that I'm going to be talking about: who, what, why, and how. And with an aim, ultimately, and I think really is about implementation. We've talked a lot about concepts. I am going to start off my comments with some concepts about the what, but then move into the how. So that's going to be the focus. And again, my understanding after my many years of experience in this area is that really the human dimensions, the social dimensions are absolutely critical to finding key solutions. We talk a lot about plants, about soil, about the climate, about the air, but ultimately we as human beings are change makers. We also create lots of problems. We know that, of course, contributors to problems. But I share the optimism that Karen expressed earlier of really seeing the capacity and the power of individual innovation and resilience as human beings, not just as in our natural systems, have this resilience and ability to find and make change. So that's kind of going to be the crux of a lot of my comments today. I've had the fortune of, as Tim mentioned, of working in a lot of different sectors, a lot of different contexts, with a lot of different people from so many different walks of life, from grassroots individuals, very poor farmers in Central America and Africa and Asia, also working with policymakers in Washington, D.C., and many things in between, many farmers. Nowadays, I work a lot with students and faculty, which is a delight. And I've also found that working at all these different levels gives great insight into what are the potential solutions and what are the actual solutions that people are carrying out. Now, I want to start off with kind of what is the problem before we get into what are solutions. And I think one of the things that Karen referred to this, Secretary Ross, excuse me, that there's often the popular framing of the dilemma that we face is one of feeding 9 billion. That's a projection for the future. And that is based on important assumptions about our current level of consumption, the current level of waste that we have. And the result of that focus of feeding 9 billion often is a focus on production and increase of yields, which is certainly a very important factor. But we also have to recognize that the reality is that, in fact, per capita, if you calculate, there is sufficient total food produced in the world to feed all. But the food does not reach those most in need. And it was pointed out earlier today that very much of the problem that we face has to do with poverty, inequity, and injustice. Now, that's not to dismiss the importance of increasing yields and production, absolutely not. But we have to address the issues of distribution, poverty, inequity, and that's a really important human dimension that makes us rethink our assumptions and our framing of the problem. So, as Karen pointed out again, we have these complex human dimensions. We have incredible problems with food insecurity, malnutrition, alongside obesity. And it's very complicated to figure that out. What kind of food is reaching people? And interestingly, this very problem comes down to some common causes. That again, it's lack of access to healthy food often contributes to both of those dimensions, to both obesity and hunger. We have extreme waste along extreme want. And even in California alone, 1 in 6 people are considered food insecure. Now how can we imagine that in the face of the incredible wealth of produce that we have in our economy today? In our incredibly rich agricultural region, yet we have hunger. And some of the cities of the Central Valley are some of the poorest in our state. So it's very, very disconcerting that we have these dimensions of inequities. And of course, we talk about unsustainability in terms of the environmental dimensions, which are very important to framing the problem. So again, it's not just about feeding the 9 billion, but doing that in a way that reduces these impacts on the environment, which have created such high costs to society. So when I come back to a key challenge, a reframing is certainly we have to be concerned about feeding the 9 billion. But we also have to be concerned about how to create sustainable food systems that meet all needs. And that doesn't mean we do it for other people. That's another thing we always popularly hear, we must feed the world. Well, it's really how to enable people to feed their own selves through changes in very often social issues as well as environmental. So that brings me to the question, what do we mean by sustainable? Now again, people have talked a little about that concept. It's very confusing because there are so many terms being thrown out, and very often some of these terms are being co-opted and used in a variety of ways. And I think that it really is a bit hard to make sense of all these terms. This morning, Paul was talking about regenerative, which is another wonderful term that I think one that's becoming more and more used in this whole the whole field. But I do want to return to the question of what is sustainability, and I think many of you, probably most of you, have heard of the triple bottom line. Is that a common? Okay. But I think to a lot of people, the triple bottom line does express sustainability, but we often tend to leave out the people part. We think of the environmental part, the planet, and of course profit. But we really need to think of this as win-win solutions where people become really central in that equation. So again, when we talk about sustainable food systems at the Berkeley Food Institute, we're really referring to ensuring that all people have access to nutritious and affordable food that is produced in a way that's sustainable and equitable to promote health of the planet and health of people. Does that make sense? Okay, so it's a very holistic perception, really putting people at the center. And the 4 elements that we talk about a lot at Berkeley is diversity, justice, resilience, and health. And those are concepts that are not only important in natural systems, but also in social systems. So I'll get into that a little bit more. Now, I also want to just say, what do we mean by food systems? That's another concept that, again, a lot of this discussion in the conference has been on agriculture and on production. But if we think about agriculture, it really is contextualized by the larger food system. I have this diagram which often shows the food system as the circle of actors or processes from production to distribution to consumption to waste to input suppliers, that whole system. But all of those systems and those processes and actors are influenced by broader forces, both political, social, and also access to information and knowledge. So I think the food system, again, is something that individual producers, if you ask the farmers who are here today, most of them are directly affected by the markets to which they buy. We heard about that this morning, to which they sell, And they're also very affected by the policies, the regulations. So really, decisions can't be made independently of these broader food system questions. That's why when we're looking for solutions, it isn't only about what they're using in the field, what people are using in the field, what we can adopt at the local level, but how we can make changes in the broader level on things that go much beyond the individual farm. So coming back to this issue of framing the problem in this, or framing the challenges, we really need to see this in the broader food systems perspective and understand how individual farmers' decisions can be facilitated or thwarted by those factors. So now I want to turn to how, within that broad context, how to develop promising food system changes. And I would say that we can look around this room and find people. How many of you are producers, farmers? How many people are in food service or in food serving of some kind? Okay, we have a few of those. Are there people involved in policy? A few? Okay. So we have people in all different levels really engaged in making change. And I think that all of you could share stories today about what you're doing to make a difference. My feeling is that we've spent too much time reinventing the wheel and repeating things that have gone on in the past. And I think that we learned earlier this morning that there has been some really good cross-fertilization and sharing, and that's a lot of what we need to do. So I want to just reflect on the fact that there are all these positive efforts on not only in sustainable farming, but also market changes, food access. You heard from Karen Ross and the policy changes that are going on there. But very often they're small and isolated. And now I think they're gaining more and more momentum. But these are supposed to be, they look kind of like funny drops, but they're supposed to be like seeds. But I see seeds of change throughout the food system. And those come from production, from marketing, from policies, from urban groups, from food sovereignty, workers' rights. I mean, it really does consist of a huge range of people and efforts. And again, I look to these leaders and innovators, and it's not just people at high-level positions. It's people from the grassroots up who I really feel provide great inspiration and optimism for the change that can happen. So now going on to how, besides having these local level activities, I want to get into what I call these sort of 4 Ps and people at the center. But first of all, applying principles of agroecology and sustainability. And then I'm going to talk about policy, just very briefly, because we've already heard quite a bit about policy. And then power changes and empowerment, which I'll talk about, and then partnerships. And partnerships is one of the key elements, I'd say. So starting with production. Now, we've heard this morning again about this, so I'm not going to elaborate too much, but I'll provide a few examples. These are sort of some of the basic principles rather than practices that I believe are based on my experience. I shouldn't say I believe, but based on my practical experience as well, have proven to be really important elements of both agroecology and sustainability. Using a systems approach, recognizing all these interactions. We heard this morning from our farmers and also from Renata about some of these issues, so I'm not going to go in great depth. But biodiversity is a really important element of production change, and that comes again at different levels. And I'll give some examples in a minute. Soil health and health of ecosystems is another part of fundamental agroecology, agroecological principles, and it can be approached in various ways. Ecologically based pest management, oops, I got those words messed up. Resource conservation, water and energy, and important other element of sustainability at the production level is, of course, social responsibility. That it's, again, not just the environmental and the biophysical dimensions, but the social dimensions. And again, building on successes, because we have had many successes in using these approaches and finding them economically viable. I think that's really important to understand, is that producers are realizing that these things make economic sense, these kinds of practices. And I think one of the great examples where you see this happening is in diversified farming systems. We actually have some really interesting research going on at Berkeley. A whole group, a center on diversified farming systems. It's not purely about being organic, but there's actually some really great evidence doing a broad meta-study. Two of our researchers did a really interesting article or analysis looking at yield differentials. People often say, and it was brought up this morning, that there's often a yield reduction when you produce organically. But in fact, this overview of many, many studies from around the world has showed that when you have diversity in organic systems, that the yield productivity can equal or even surpass the conventional systems. Now, this is not really just about a comparative analysis as well. I think it's just important to recognize that diversity at the soil level, at the plant level, at the species, has multiple benefits. So we've seen this. It's not only the ecological side, but also the economic side and even the social. So I don't have time to really delve into this, but it is really an important element of ecological and sustainable agriculture. The other example I want to give to you, again, based more on some of the experience I had for many years working in the wine industry, and that was with the changes that are happening in wine grape growing. It's actually, to me, really encouraging to see the changes that have occurred. If you look at some of the kind of past, even just turn back the clock 10 years, there's a huge number of vineyards that are highly monoculture and also almost strictly done in unsustainable ways, put it that way. And a lot of that has been significantly changed in the last several years to much more integrated systems and also diverse systems. Now, it doesn't mean that they're changing from being grapes, but at least they're incorporating much more diversity with very successful results. And one example of that is when you drive through, even in this area, there are very massive vineyards, but you have more and more diversity of the plant life because people are allowing cover crops to grow with recognition that they have great benefits for beneficial insects and also for soil carbon, for preventing runoff. So they have all these benefits that many years ago you wouldn't have known, or many growers would not recognize that they have those benefits. So that's just one example. But so the wine industry in general is taking a systems approach. I can't say this is categorically or across the board all vineyards, but we've seen more and more change happening. And we've done some actually surveying of wine grape growers that have indicated that there's very significant adoption of changes of these types of practices, partly through the educational programs that we've developed. So the changes involve vineyard and ecosystem practices, as well as winery practices and social responsibility practices in this sort of triple bottom line. I can give just a few examples, just a few images of the types of changes that have been adopted. But I also just want to point out that a lot of this happens through leadership of individuals and of groups. And I just put a few pictures here of people that have been leaders. You met Paul Dolan this morning. He's just been a real champion. Karen Ross has been another person, but growers themselves from the grassroots. And I have to say this is not, again, always people that are at high-level positions, but workers themselves who are engaged in change. And so I think it's really important to recognize that even though I'm showing you pictures that are physical practices, that there are always people behind them coming up with these innovations. This is just an example of the tremendous type of integration of diversity into the landscape, into vineyard operations, which have been shown to really have multiple benefits. Now, you lose some area of productive capacity, but the benefits through the reduction of chemical use and other benefits can offset those losses of area that's actually put into production. Cover crops, as I mentioned, have been widely adopted now. When Fetzer Vineyards was one of the early adopters of cover crops back in the 90s, that is integrating these plants between the vineyard rows, they were thought to be crazy. And people thought that they're just letting their weeds grow. Well, that was literally in the early 1990s. Now, you just drive down 101 and you see many, many, many growers have what you might look like weeds between the vines. But in fact, those have function. And Fetzer was one of the early innovators in that and actually was engaged in teaching many people about the values of cover crops between vines. Soil health, again, other people have talked about this, but in the vineyard operations, we used a lot of compost, but there's other ways to enhance soil health, including cover crops. Water conservation is another important practice in the vineyards. And, really, as Karen mentioned earlier, vineyards have actually been pretty good at dry farming and other innovations in reducing water use. Diversity also is expressed in the integration of animals into the farming systems. There's more and more use of things like goats and sheep, chickens between the vines. So it's not so common, but more and more that's happening. You see the animals being integrated into cropping systems. And then, of course, we can't leave out the importance of energy. And renewable energy is something that more and more farmers are investing in. So, and last but not least is the social responsibility element. Again, respect of the workers, and there were comments about that just earlier. Engagement of workers, worker protection and safety and health, all that is part of sustainability. And I have to say that I think one of the really exciting things, and I'm going to return to this theme at the very end of my talk today, is the outreach and sharing that happens, farmer-to-farmer exchange. And again, I know the farmers in the room here have been active in that. There's a number of farming associations, there's commodity groups, there's cooperative extension. All of these efforts where people are engaged in a process of sharing and outreach, I think is a really important element of making change. Again, building upon successes, and farmers who have become innovators can share with others. Okay, yeah, and participatory approaches are crucial. I just want to say in the wine industry that has resulted in this proliferation of many, many different wineries and vineyards that are involved in these different green programs. I'm going to talk a little more about that in a minute. Okay, so in addition to the changes that happen at the local level, many of these things can't happen without having markets changes and policy changes. So, I mean, we've heard about the constraints that growers face in making changes. But I just want to stress that you have to make changes in the broader food system, not just at the local level. So that leads me to the other P's that I mentioned earlier. Policy changes are definitely urgently needed to enable these kinds of changes to happen at the local level. Now, we know that regulatory burdens can be a real challenge for farmers, But there's also examples of good programs, policies and funding that's coming from the federal level and from the state level that can help to facilitate these kinds of changes. You have probably all heard of the Know Your Farmer, Know Your Food program that was at the federal level. There's also a number of conservation provisions of the Farm Bill that allow farmers to get funding for innovative practices, whether it be cover crops or composting or water conservation or soil conservation. And how many of you farmers here have taken advantage of the EQIP programs or NRCS? A few? Okay, just a few. It's actually a really great program that a lot of people don't realize, but it's one of the areas where I think farmers can really gain from excellent federal level programs that provide incentives for these types of practices. There's also young farmer and rancher programs. The market match programs is more on the food side, but these kinds of things I think are all positive. And of course, Renata spoke earlier this morning about some of the changes that are happening in the energy and climate change as well. I do think that there's a lot of change still needed in the policy arena. Some of the existing policies are still thwarting sustainability efforts and really creating more challenges for producers to make changes. And I think that's a really important element that has to be altered. We also need more incentives for regional, local, and direct marketing opportunities, and also work in the area of worker health and worker rights, which does relate to immigration reform, which was discussed earlier. So I think given the time we have today, I'm not going to elaborate more on policy changes, but it is essential, and we see the positive effects happening. And I put out some pictures here of just people, again, recognizing that policy doesn't happen in a vacuum. It takes all of us in this room to write to our congresspeople or run for Congress or be engaged in a policy process. And I have a number of people here who are luminaries in the food change, but also people who are working as food advocates and, policy advocates and agriculture advocates at the grassroots, including Renata Brillinger, who she and CalCan are doing amazing things to help instigate change from the grassroots, from organizations that can help to affect policy. So I really think that that's part of change, again, is for all of us to be involved, not only in voting, but in approaching your politicians and getting engaged in political activism. The third P that I was talking about is power. Well, it's very hard to affect power as individuals, but one of the comments earlier was about market power. I mean, we face real challenges in the huge influence. We talk about unhealthy food or unhealthy or consolidated food systems. It's very hard for farmers starting out or doing new things to gain into markets to allow them to provide economically viable businesses. So I think that there's really need for more and more regional and local opportunities. There's direct marketing efforts that I think are really important in bringing about these sorts of changes. It comes from demand, it comes from consumers, but there also has to be changes that allow for more room and more diversity in the marketing opportunities. So I think that can come partly through direct marketing, but there's a lot more work needs to be done. I'm going to comment briefly here about sustainable certification programs, and I know the next speaker is going to talk more about that, because I think that's one area where there's some real promising efforts happening. One area also where there's a change in market opportunities is the rise of direct marketing and linking farming directly with consumers. Farmers market are just one small example of that. In a way, it's a very small niche in compared to huge supermarkets and other type, but in California and throughout the United States, farmers markets are becoming more and more important, and especially for small farmers trying to break into alternative systems. So this is a little bit old, but just shows this incredible growth in farmers markets. Another area which, again, a lot of people have been seeing as a niche, but is expanding extremely rapidly, is the organic market. And again, there were comments about that. That definitely gives added values to farmers. But you just see, again, tremendous growth. Even during the downturn in 2008, 2009. It continued to have gained to some extent, and now we're seeing another huge upsurge in organic demand and in organic marketing opportunities. So I think it's actually an exciting trend, and as our Grimway producer spoke about this morning, there's a great deal that can be learned from organic growing that can be transferred or merged into conventional growing. That's one thing that I've been very interested in watching when I worked in the wine industry, that even if producers didn't adopt certified organic practices, a lot of the practices being used by organic farmers were incorporated more and more into conventional farming. I see that as a really positive trend, where we can see this kind of convergence, but there's not this kind of clear us versus them, but yet people moving forward. It doesn't mean that organic's always better, but that there are important principles from that production system that generally work much more in harmony with natural resources and make economic sense as well. There's a lot of other alternative marketing and certification programs as well. Excuse me. That really include sustainability and justice issues. And people have sometimes commented, are these niche markets, are they going to remain really small? And in a way, there is that concern. There's also so many different programs that compete. It's hard to know if they can actually survive. But they are gaining strength in many ways. There's the example of these multiple certification programs are found in the wine industry. And it's amazing how many of them there are that are regional. There's some that some of you probably heard in this region. There's one called SIP Certified, which is Sustainability in Practice. Thank you very much, Tim. Appreciate that. Thanks. Talking too much, sorry. So yeah, these programs are regionally based and involve farmers very actively in providing, again, farmer-to-farmer sharing of information. And they've been very promising in getting a lot of people involved. This next slide shows, this is although they started off at a regional level, this program has kind of escalated into a California statewide program called the California Sustainable Wine Growing Program. And they developed a certification program just a couple of years ago, and it has really escalated. Actually, it's about 4 years ago. And now you can see that about 15% of the California acres are certified in this program, and about 57 of the cases produced in the wineries are represented in this program. So it's pretty significant to see the engagement. Now, it doesn't mean that all of these growers and these wineries are fully embracing all the dimensions of the sustainability program, but at least they're moving along a trajectory of improvement. And it's just, to me, it was very exciting to be part of that and to be actually directly engaged. I was mostly involved before the certification program was begun, because it started very much as an education program, a farmer-to-farmer education program, just getting people really engaged in the process of adopting changes and learning from each other. So it was a very open approach, and now it's gotten a little bit almost competitive about who's greener. And in a way, that's kind of positive, because you see everybody moving in a positive direction. The other form of besides market changes and market opportunities, you also see empowerment through access to knowledge and education. And that's another thing that I think, again, as I mentioned earlier, having these farmer-to-farmer exchanges and interaction with students is just more and more engagement across different commodities and different farmer groups, I think, is an important part of this change. I want to end on my last P, which is partnerships. And I think that I see just great opportunity to continue these kind of building of partnerships. Right now, there's actually multiple, what you might call food movements. There's a lot of them are not connected. But the more we come together and find coalitions, build collaborations across the different groups and different disciplines, to me seems like a very positive direction. So that can happen partly through research and education efforts, partnerships with farmers, with scientists, Also, but engaging people involved in the food movement, with businesses, with farmer markets, with also worker groups, to find these ability to collaborate across different groups. I also think it's extremely important, very often people of so-called minorities or diverse groups in our society are left out and are voiceless in the process of change. And I feel that this is an area, food is an area that touches all of us. It motivates all of us. It brings us together in a way that has to be inclusive. And there's such innovation and interest on the part of low-income families, diverse cultural groups in our society. You know, Karen Ross mentioned earlier that we have an incredible diverse agricultural sector. That diversity is an incredible wealth, not only in terms of the crops and the plants and the wonderful abundance of foods that we eat, but also the people that we have. So engaging and empowering, enabling all people to have opportunity to be involved in and have access to healthy and nutritious food, I think is part of our responsibility as a society. So engaging people in food security and health efforts is equally as important as sustainability in production. So again, through these collective initiatives and partnerships, I think it's really important to continue to build empowerment, increase collaboration among scientists, farmers, students, educators, and all people who can affect this kind of policy and a practical change towards increasing sustainability. So with that, I guess I should close and, yeah. I think we got some.
Thank you, Anne.
But I would like to offer some, yeah.
Yeah, we have a couple minutes for questions, if anyone would like to come up and ask Anne about your experience in especially the wine industry. Kudos with your work with the Berkeley Food Institute. Looks like you have a lot of amazing things happening there.
Yeah, it's a lot going on. We have hundreds of students
Wow.
who are incredibly interested in different aspects of food systems.
And a lot of events.
Yeah,
So,
a lot
so
of
the
events.
response has been good, it looks like. I mean, you're fairly new, right?
Yeah, we're only about
So,
2 years old.
yeah.
But a lot going on.
Yeah,
it's good.
great.
I'm sure somebody has a question. No? Yes.
Yeah, shout it out.
That we have agriculture that pays properly, and it seems like I've been to a number of these conferences and talks, and there's always these good ideas, and farmers are well-intentioned people, and we share information, and yet nothing seems to be changing, and the number of people in this country that farm actually goes down every year.
Yeah.
And if the Census Bureau, right now, I don't know if anybody knows this, but the qualify as a farmer according to the United States Census, you only have to produce $1,000 worth of food or fiber gross, and you qualify as a farmer. If you raise that bar to just $10,000, we lose fully half of all the people in the United States that qualify as farmers. So we have essentially about 66,000 people producing 3/4 of all the food and fiber in this country. In my opinion, something has to change, and I'm curious from a policy point of view, how you might encourage agriculture to take greater importance and how food quality issues and the economics involved in food could change for the positive so that our sector is not continually shrinking
Yeah.
and going to concentrated farms and has a greater investment from the populace at large.
Those are incredibly important, and a lot you've said. I think that this is an extremely important issue. I know Karen Ross has actually spoken about that quite a bit too, the whole issue of cheapening of food, and that the unhealthy food has become, is cheapest, and it's a reverse on what it should be, that nutritious, good food is actually too expensive, or expensive compared to cheap food, but cheap food should actually be more expensive. So I don't have an easy answer for you by any means to many complex questions you've just raised, but certainly you've raised issues of the problems of consolidation in the market, which I referred to, the lack of opportunity for small farmers to get squeezed out. I think all those are really important. One global initiative that's going on that I think could shed some light on this issue, or maybe perhaps change it. It's basically efforts to do what's called full cost accounting or true cost accounting, to really shift our accounting procedures for pricing of food to try to account for the actual externalities and the negative impacts of, so-called conventional industrial farming, to actually change the prices so that actually reflects all of the negative impacts that are actually associated with that food production system. Do you see what I mean? So that unhealthy food, that processed food would all actually be much higher in what we pay. Now, the proposition behind this has emerged really strongly in England, and actually the Prince of Wales has been a strong proponent of what's called full cost accounting, so that the nutritional food has a good value. But then, of course, you have the question of affordability. So who suffers from not paying enough food? I mean, food, in many ways, food should be a right. And that's the whole kind of a concept of right to food is a really strong cry, kind of an appeal for a lot of people in Europe working on these issues, that we should all have a right to food. And whose responsibility is that? But at least to start with the issue of full cost accounting could try to change things. Now, how much traction that's going to actually receive is difficult because it raises huge political questions. When you start talking about raising prices of bread or wheat or soy or corn so that it's actually higher, that creates a huge political burden for people to try to propose that. So I don't have the answers, but I think it's a really important question because it goes fundamentally to our economic system of accounting, which doesn't make sense. So.
Well, and I'd almost give a nod to the work that Ann does and even the work that we do here at Cal Poly. It almost seems like there needs to be a cultural change, a shift, before those attitudes are translated into policy and so forth. And I can't speak for Secretary Ross, but I think from my perspective, part of the hope is just looking at the younger generations. I mean, educators in agriculture, a place like Cal Poly has always been strong in agriculture, so maybe this is a little bit of an anomaly, but not necessarily Berkeley in the past couple of years. And so if you say compare students today versus 20 years ago, farming and food wasn't quite the popular topic as it is today. And it's really energizing students and so on, and who knows? I mean, we can only hope that this catches on and that people do have a deeper awareness of where their food is coming from, and then that will be translated into better policies that support farmers, that support agriculture. I mean, that's the hope.
Yeah,
and education has a role to play in that. Right?
Yeah, and so, I would agree. I know I hear your concerns for sure, but despite this kind of change in demographics and the aging of the population of farmers and the shrinking of numbers, there is an upsurge of people who are very incredibly interested in getting involved in farming.
There's a time lag there. I mean, as someone once said, it took many decades, at least a half a century, to build the industrial food system, right? It's going to take many decades probably to evolve a new system that isn't so focused on cheap calories and so on. So.
And I think we have to be careful of not vilifying, industrial big agriculture, because that's evolving too. But understanding, the consolidation and concentration in the system does currently thwarts innovation and alternatives, I think, in many ways. So the more we can strengthen those alternative perspectives and get more and more young people engaged, I think it's really important.
Great. Well, kudos to you. Thank you, Ann.
Thank you.